It's Agribusiness Today, your Sports Radio 92.3 and 1450. The noon show continues here midweek, and let's hop off to a BRANDT Spotlight on a Wednesday. And typically we do these on Fridays, but we've got the Cubs kind of cutting into our time the next couple of days. So let's find out what's going on in area fields, also out of the BRANDT Research Farm with Eric Winans, Research Farm Manager with BRANDT. How are you doing today, Eric? Things are just lovely out in the neighborhood.
Yeah, the weather's nice. We had a mild week here, and we're getting a lot done here at the research farm, getting some post applications done and starting some of our foliar trials.
You know what, though? Again, a 20% chance of rain pays off for some yesterday. Late in the afternoon, kind of the early evening, a couple of little thunderstorms popped up, and I think it's just really wearing on people's nerves, especially where they get to be thinking about, boy, that hit the one field that still got some wet holes in it, or the one field I still haven't gotten planted, so we're thinking of replant, we're thinking of late planting, and now if you're sitting there trying to get that all worked out in your head, if you're farming, Eric, how much should you be thinking about going, well, I need to really drastically alter the seed or the amount of population that I'm putting in to my soybeans, my maturity or my soybean population? Is it a time to act boldly?
And I was thinking about that this week. We're getting these pop-up showers and we're getting pretty good rains, which is excellent for this crop that's already up and established. And this time last year, we couldn't buy a rain like what we've been getting. But yeah, now we're at this point where we've still got some acres that need replant or haven't even been planted yet. And we're approaching June here. And yeah, we're getting a lot of questions on, what are things that I can do to manage this better, in terms of my maturity group or my, relative maturity in corn, what population should I be dropping? And I don't want guys to drop maturities as drastically as some people may think. We have to remember how much top end yield potential we're going to give up if we go to a sub 100-day corn hybrid. Typically we're in that 114 to 118 day range here in central Illinois. I think as we get into June, we can think about dropping, below that a little bit, getting between that 105 to 110 day. But, we have to remember here in central Illinois and southern Illinois, as we move south especially, we don't have as great of a risk of frost. We have a little bit longer growing season than folks do up in northern Illinois. And so I think we're going to give up too much yield if we really drop below that 105 to 100 day corn. So I want to stay, in that range. And another thing to really remember too, is we're planting into warmer soils now. And so, this crop is establishing fairly rapidly. We're getting really even uniform emergence, and it's getting off to an excellent start with the temperature and moisture that we do have. But with this moisture, one thing we don't want to do, we don't want to make a bad situation worse, is plant into too wet of conditions. I've seen some of that already where, we approached the kind of the middle of May there, and we got a shot around May 20th in there. And guys were right after it, trying to rush to get a lot of this crop in. And this corn's coming up, and I'm seeing that we've compacted a lot of that, or maybe left that seed trench open in places because it was just still a little too wet to get in there and plant. Now on soybean, one thing that we like to, do as we get, to the end of May and the start of June on soybean is we start to think about raising that planting population, by, right now we're in this last week of May. We need to be thinking about maybe being 5 to 10% higher in our planting population than we were at the start of May. And as we get into June, maybe 5 to 10% higher than that even. Because what we're making up for is nodes on that main stem. Soybeans have indeterminate growth, meaning they go through vegetative growth and reproductive growth concurrently at the same time, and that's a big advantage to planting earlier, is we can stack more nodes on that main stem. That's more points of attachment for pods, which is really going to drive yield. But as we're planting later, we're not going to have as tall of a soybean crop. We're going to struggle to close that canopy, and we're not going to have as many nodes on that main stem. So we try to make up for those nodes or that lack of pods by planting more plants in within the row. And that's also going to drive competition and help these soybean varieties close that canopy quicker as we're planting later.
Eric, what do we think about trying to do something with all those wet holes then that we see? Is it worth trying to go out and plant and spot in seed to all of those little areas that are drowned out right now, and once they dry out, once they're fit to plant, you can get something in there and do something? Or how do you approach that situation that folks are certainly seeing this year?
Yeah, and I think the forecast is going to look all right for that. We're not getting these, 1, 2 inch plus rains, or down in Carlinville area. I heard they had around 7 inches here, this past weekend. Once things are drying out, though, I do think it's important that we get in there and plant those. And again, I think, staying in that, above 100-day maturity corn range. And then even holding in our soybean maturity groups, when we're selecting varieties, because we don't want to give up that top end yield. And, if we go to a really short maturity bean variety, kind of like, guys are thinking, comparing this to maybe a double crop scenario where we're coming in after wheat. If we go to something really short, we're going to struggle to close that canopy, especially in a 30-inch row scenario. But if we have the option to get in with 15-inch beans, or maybe even drill in some beans into some of those wet holes, that's really going to help us close that canopy quicker and suppress weed development.
On the bean side of things, obviously you want the plants, you want the beans, you want the yield, but you talk about closing the canopy, probably that's got to be at least half of the equation just in that spot in the field to make sure you've got soybeans growing there, covering things up, as opposed to a huge flush and a huge opportunity for weeds to really take off in that one spot.
And then we're going to have to stay on top of our residuals as well. And, this, just like planting has been spread out over a course of a couple months now at this point, so is herbicide applications. We started putting on pre's back at the start of April, and, some spots haven't even been in with a post yet. And so, some scenarios may require, 2 post applications, or maybe, run in different, parts of your field at different timings just to take care of some of these weeds. And the other big thing too, that's going to be a challenge for us, is the development, the emergence of some of these insects. We've got a lot of crop out there at different stages that's going to affect these crops at different stages in its life cycle. We take stink bug, for instance, stink bug and bean leaf beetle both. Those are insects that overwinter here in our soils. And their survivability is really dependent on the temperatures that we have over winter. And we've had a mild enough winter that I've been seeing enough problems with some of these insects. And, corn that we planted in April and was going through those early vegetative stages here a few weeks ago, I've been seeing enough stink bug feeding on the corn whorls and the leaves themselves. That's, going to cause some concern. And so I think, also getting in here and controlling some of these insects is going to be really important for us with this crop this year.
Talking to Eric Winans today, Research Farm Manager with BRANDT. Hey, total off-the-wall question. You mentioned insects. Everybody right now is dealing with cicadas all over the place. Brood 1, Brood 2. Maybe they're all going at the same time at your place, Eric. Do the cicadas offer any sort of potential damage or ramification to agriculture on the corn or soybean side, or anything else that you know of?
Nothing that I know of directly. I don't think there's not going to be any negative effect of these cicadas. If anything, it could be positive. If they're feeding on some of our harmful insects that we have that could potentially impact this crop. But I don't think that it poses any direct concern. But I was just talking about it today. Out at my house. Out in the country outside of Mount Auburn, Illinois, about this time of year, all I can hear is the bullfrogs down at the pond. But now I hear the screaming of these cicadas as well. So they're definitely a nuisance.
Maybe those bullfrogs are getting fat, too. I think those things are going to be well fed by the time this cicada invasion is over. We were talking about soybeans a moment ago, too, and you planted soybeans at the research farm late March. A number of guys planted soybeans maybe late March, maybe the very first week or two of April. Those soybeans, Eric, right now, what reproductive stage are they at?
So the soybeans that I planted on March 28th, they're already at the R1 growth stage. So they're putting on flowers currently. They started flowering yesterday, which is a really great sign. And that's the big reason why we're trying to drive planting date earlier and earlier, to really drive maximum yield. Again, we talked about soybean and the challenge of it being planted later is that we're not going to have as many nodes on that main stem. Soybean has that indeterminate growth where it's going to go through vegetative stages and reproductive stages at the same time. This sign that we're flowering earlier here, but we're still going to be stacking more nodes on that main stem stem. We're going to be branching. That's going to be points of attachment for pods as well. We're going to really drive pod number on these soybeans. And this is really where the season really starts to take off for our soybean crop, is when we approach R1. This is when nutrient demand, water demand really starts to pick up, and this is when we can really start to make yield. So here we are, about a month ahead of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and we're already flowering in these soybeans, which is a really good sign for the top end yield. And so I'd be on the lookout for folks that put in, soybean crop there and early April or around Easter timing. They're going to be flowering here, the end of this week and into this weekend.
What's been the impact on how wet it's been on fertility? You mentioned a little bit on the soybean side of things, but across all aspects here, Eric, especially in the corn crop, do we think we're still holding on to a lot of this applied nitrogen so far?
And that's been a big concern. And actually, I pulled some data here. It's been about a month ago, or sorry, not a month ago. It's been about a week ago. It was actually May 16th. I went in. We have a nitrogen trial out here at the research farm where we're looking at fall applied ammonia versus 28 in the spring. We've also got some treatments where we're, only have half of our N on, and then we side dress the rest. We're putting a little bit on with the planter and side dressing the rest. But, to make a long story short, where we had 180 units on in the fall or 180 units on in the spring, we still have anywhere from 135 to 155 pounds of nitrogen available there in the top foot of soil with the sampling that we took a little over a week ago, which is a really good sign that we're holding on to a lot of that nitrogen. And actually, for that fall applied nitrogen, 180 pounds, we still had about 32 pounds in the ammoniacal form, which is going to hold in our soil really nicely here. And we're also at a point where we're, these soils are warming up. We're going to be mineralizing a fair amount of nitrogen to help feed this crop as we go through these rapid growth stages through mid vegetation. So, I think across the majority of our acres, we do have, a substantial amount of nitrogen available for this crop, and I haven't seen a lot of deficiency in terms of nitrogen or sulfur, especially in areas where we're managing sulfur and nitrogen appropriately. But there are going to be scenarios, some of these wet holes are prone to denitrification, and that's just something that we're going to have to sample on an environment by environment scenario and watch this crop as it goes through these early vegetative stages and kind of make an assessment on, do we need a side dress in some of these scenarios.
Well, Eric, ran through a lot. Weather here over the short run looks pretty good. We're on the cool side of things. We're certainly seasonal. We're not getting into these upper 80s or low 90s this time at the end of May. But as you look out ahead this week, I know people still got work to do. They've got fields to plant. They've got replant to discuss with themselves, with their agronomists, like we were talking about at the beginning of this. Any other kind of big issues or something you just want to leave people with today as they get ready for still a really busy time period out on the farm and in those fields?
Another thing to really pay attention to, back in our soybean crop, soybeans have had some pretty wet feet here for the past month or so. And that can always be a concern, with soybean especially. Soybeans have to, manufacture a lot of their own nitrogen through, symbiotic association with Bradyrhizobium bacteria, those nodules. This would be a time, too, to get out there and look at your soybean crop, dig up some roots and look at the nodules that are developing on that main taproot and, cut some of those open. You'll see a pinkish reddish color if they're active. And that's going to be really important to, really push in this soybean crop, especially as we're approaching R1 here, because it's got a large demand for nitrogen, especially on a per bushel basis. It requires more nitrogen than corn does. And so we want to make sure that crop is, manufacturing that nitrogen to keep up with its pace.
He is Eric Winans, Research Farm Manager with BRANDT, our guest here on the Noon Show. Thank you very much for your time, Eric.
Yep. Thanks for having me, Steve.